All the time people tell you you're living in an illusion, reality ain't what it seems. People say stuff like that from a biochemical perspective, from a political or philosophical perspective. Well, I spoke with Iain McGilchrist, who's a psychiatrist who uses neurology for the basis of a lot of his analysis, particularly the difference between the left and right brain, the relationship between those two hemispheres, and how that impacts our perspective culturally and socially as a species. In this conversation with Iain McGilchrist that took place in my podcast, Under the Skin, available on Luminary, you can get it anywhere in the world from Apple, we started talking about the nature of reality. Iain McGilchrist is amazing. You might have seen him already talking to Jordan Peterson. You might have read his book, The Master and His Emissary. If you haven't, you're in for a real treat, because this conversation is fantastic. In this bit that we're giving you here, he talks about how even something like a mountain, something you think of as permanent, ancient, beyond the mind and scope of humanity, there is continual movement, and our perception of it is a kind of construction, that we live within scales of not only dimensions, but also time, temporal scale. We don't understand reality. Now, what that does to me is both simultaneously terrifies me, but heartens me too, because it makes me understand that when we assume something is static, it ain't static. When we assume we know about something, we don't know nothing. We've been inculcated, educated, and bewildered into seeing reality in a particular way, and we can alter our perception of reality through certain practices. But in this conversation, we're just establishing some of the terms. You'll love this conversation. Stay to the end.
Those of us that have quite turbulent inner lives, and I'll speak just for myself, my experience of reality alters pretty radically, almost on an hourly basis over the course of a day. I feel like sort of despair and great joy, and doubts about like even the most casual, acquaintanceships, that they can bring about in me a kind of sense of mobility. How do we, because there's so much complexity in your work, it seems to me, and as we just experienced by, although you did give a kind of an elevator pitch, it's not an easy thing to summarize. In your work, how do you, given the example that I've my example of like my own inability to cope with reality and how the vicissitudes of an ordinary day, how does your work apply there? Given that, okay, we are saying that there is a truth, that we're not going to sort of plunge headfirst into relativism or nihilism. Well, how does your work help you or me deal with reality?
Well, I think the example you gave of how when nothing that you can point to has objectively changed, but nonetheless the way you see the world has changed, it's a very nice down-to-earth example of how what is real to us is variable, and each of these ways of looking at things has some aspect of that reality. So the way in which we approach the world, the way in which we attend to the world is a really important concept. And I'm sure if you've been looking at a few of my talks, you'll find that I almost always come down to this question of attention. How you attend to something changes what you find there, and it also changes you. So the same perfectly real set of circumstances has different aspects, and depending on how you attend to it, you find something different there. I sometimes give the example of a mountain behind my house, which is a particularly striking looking piece of the landscape. And its name in Norse means the sloping rock. And that means that 2,000 or, well, probably less than that, actually 1,000 years ago, when the Norsemen came down here, they used the outline of the mountain, which is a sloping one, as a landmark that warned them that they were about to enter a bay where there were many shipwrecks. So to them, it was a very important sort of warning and a safety sign. But we also know that long before that, there were Picts living in brochs around the base of it. And for them, this was the home of the gods, and it also provided shelter from the storms. And then in the 18th century, people came up here and started painting and drawing it. And then in the 19th century, geologists came and appreciated the fact that it's made of columnar basalt. If I asked a physicist what it's made of, he'd say, well, 99.99% of it is just space, and what the rest of it is, we don't know. All these descriptions of the mountain are perfectly real. I mean, they're not fantasies, they're not made up, and none of them is wrong. It's just that depending on the kind of attention and the priorities you have, you find the world full of a certain kind of stuff. And if you change the way you attend, you find it's completely different. So what I'm hoping to do in this book is to lead people, if you like, on a journey where we go somewhere and we look at the landscape from different angles. And I hope to convey to people something that will make them see the world differently from then on, perhaps never see it the old way again. One of the things I never anticipated about the master and his emissary was that people would write me emails saying, you know, since I've read your book, my whole life has changed, which is a very nice thing to get once, but to get it frequently is remarkable. And I suppose what it shows is that when I gave up doctoring in order to write, it wasn't true, as I thought, that I was going to stop doing what I liked to do, which was to help people. I could do that through my writing. So maybe that is a possibility.
When you're talking about that man behind your house there, Ian, I was thought about the brilliant writer and former guest on the show, Robert Macfarlane, who went writing about geology, writes about deep time, and like the geological movements could be understood as waves. He's sort of like in his book Underland, he writes about sort of looking up at some rock and for a moment flinching as if it was falling and realizing that it is falling, but just across millennia. And across the, you know, I think about this idea of sort of scale and how it relates to perception. Scale, of course, in terms of size, sort of spatial scale, but also temporal scale and the sort of speed at which we move through reality and how that alters our perception. Do you see in some sort of spiritual disciplines or Eastern mysticism that the ideas of transcendence could be an attempt to reach out to a different strata of ulterior and ever-present reality in order to achieve a kind of even momentary salvation from the sort of challenges of living entirely within your own solipsistic relationship with time?
That's a really good question. I almost feel like you must have read my book, and I know you haven't, the new one, because there are a number of things to say about that. I mean, the first thing I'd like to pick up is the idea of motion in time and space, because it's very, very important. I'm a great devotee of a 6th century BC Greek philosopher, Heraclitus, and what he's famous for saying is everything flows. And all my life, I've thought about that. And I think a lot of people think it just means everything changes, which is, yeah, true up to a point. But much more importantly, that everything flows, because you can have change where one thing just disappears and another thing suddenly comes into existence. But that's not what he was getting at. He was saying that everything is always, always in a process of flow. And so actually in the book I say about the mountain behind the house, you know, animals move fast, plants move rather slowly, mountains move very, very, very slowly. But if you had a time-lapse camera, you could see that mountain coming towards my house. And if you went on for longer than we'll probably be here to see it, you'd see it crash over the house. So scale matters hugely. And it matters very much in what I'm really very keen to do is to combat the reductionist idea, which is very much in opposition to the world picture you were mentioning of spirituality, that really it's all mechanical. And I think this is a problem of scale. If you have a very, very complex picture with lots and lots of things influencing one another, so complex that you can't possibly really work it out. Even a computer couldn't do it all. And what goes on in a single cell is that complex. But if you take a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of it, you can see a little section where there's a straight line, and you can see, oh, that leads to that. And you can intervene there. So you think, oh, it's like a machine, but it isn't like a machine in about 10 different ways, but which I go into in the book. So I think that's that's all quite relevant. The scale you look at something changes it. For example, at the most basic level, we say there are only, I don't know, 8 or 9 kinds of particles, and that's everything. But as you come up, you start to see there's a myriad complex things, that have quite different new qualities that are not there in the little 9 particles. But if you carry on to a much, much higher scale, then you see that the cosmos looks, again, rather like those atoms. And so that's another instance of how scale matters.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, perhaps you'll sign up to Luminary and listen to the whole thing. I have a brilliant conversation every week, as well as doing a guided meditation on my podcast, Above the Noise. Each podcast, 1 a week, forever, going forward, please God, inshallah. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of this conversation. Did you enjoy it? Do you agree with Iain? I mean, you can't really contest what he's saying because he's so brilliant. But what are your own insights and experiences of the phenomena that he describes? If you enjoyed the podcast, the conversation, perhaps you'll sign up to the podcast. Please sign up here to receive my mailing list so we can communicate regularly. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at this one. Similar themes, similar sort of stuff. Sign up to this channel, Awakening with Russell Brand. Learn more about well-being, philosophy, and learn techniques that are going to help you cope with this mad and crazy world. Most importantly of all, stay free.